The runway stretched like a black scar across the barren desert, shimmering under the weight of a late afternoon sun that bled red along the horizon. Heat waves danced above the cracked asphalt, making the air itself look restless, uneasy, as though the world knew something was about to happen. Beyond the runway, the base lay quiet, its watchtowers standing like sentinels, their shadows creeping longer with every passing minute. Inside the operations center, every man and woman braced in silence, their nerves tightened by the weight of expectation. They had been waiting for hours, waiting for a rescue that was supposed to arrive in orderly fashion, under the control of the tower, but unease had crawled in when the radio remained stubbornly quiet. The tower crew checked their instruments again and again, listened for the crackle of authorization codes, and each time silence met them. Still, they told themselves the aircraft was coming, that the schedule would hold, that the stranded team in the mountains would be brought home. That was what they told themselves. Yet, as the sun sank lower and the shadows thickened, even the most hardened veterans felt something wasn't right. Captain Darius Cole stood at the observation deck overlooking the tarmac, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck twitched. He had led men into firefights across deserts and jungles, had heard bullets snap past his ears like angry insects, and he knew the feel of danger when it lingered unseen. This was the same. His eyes narrowed on the empty horizon, where a faint glimmer of movement shimmered in the haze. 4 hours, the stranded recon unit had waited in the hills beyond the border, their survival hanging by threads, and every minute of delay meant their window was closing. The C-130 was supposed to be their salvation, its vast cargo hold ready to swallow them up and bring them home. But as Darius leaned forward, binoculars raised, the shimmer grew into a silhouette, 4 engines, wide wings, a bulky body lumbering through the haze. A Hercules unmistakable. The C-130. Relief, quick and shallow, rippled through the men and women gathered in the tower. Yet even as it approached, something was wrong. No radio calls. No clearance request. No coded signal. The tower crackled with static, but no voice came through. The silence was louder than the growl of the approaching engines. Lieutenant Kara Vance, her headset pressed to one ear, flicked through frequencies, her voice sharp as she barked attempts to raise the pilot. November 21, this is Echo Tower, do you copy? You are entering controlled airspace. Respond. Static. She tried again, her voice a whip of authority. Still nothing. A murmur spread through the control room. Procedures drilled into their bones screamed that this was wrong, that no military transport entered a base without clearance, without identification, without the tower's word. But the Hercules kept coming, lowering steadily, its engines thundering louder as though daring the earth to object. Cole slammed his hand on the rail and spun to his men. Scramble the ground team. Armored vehicles at the ready. If they're not talking to us, they're not ours. Move. His voice cracked across the deck like a rifle shot, sending soldiers surging into action. Boots hammered metal stairs, radios lit with commands, and weapons were checked with metallic clacks. The whole base shifted from uneasy waiting to bristling tension, every muscle coiled as the lumbering beast in the sky descended. Out on the tarmac, floodlights blazed to life, bathing the runway in harsh white. Humvees rolled into position, tires screeching against asphalt, while sand whipped around their frames. A pair of attack helicopters powered up, rotors beating the hot air, shadows slicing across the base like blades. Soldiers crouched behind barriers, rifles trained on the descending aircraft. Yet despite all the noise, the Hercules remained silent, its dark windows revealing nothing. It was an intruder cloaked in the skin of a savior, a wolf wrapped in the fleece of a shepherd. Cole's voice cut through the roar of engines, broadcasting to every ear in range. Hold fire until we know. But if that bird makes one wrong move, you light it up. His words weighed heavy, because no one wanted to pull the trigger on what should have been their salvation. The recon unit waiting beyond the hills had begged for extraction. This aircraft could be them. Or it could be the hand that slammed the door on them forever. The Hercules leveled, engines throttling back as its wheels reached for the ground. Dust erupted from the desert as its bulk descended, then slammed into the runway with a bone-deep thud. Tires screamed, smoke curling up in twin black ribbons as the massive bird hurtled forward, slowing, until it rumbled into silence near the center of the tarmac. Engines still growled, but no hatch opened, no crew waved, no radio check crackled alive. Just that hulking metal body sitting under the floodlights, reflecting a sterile sheen, its silence heavier than the desert heat. Soldiers shifted nervously, rifles following every panel, every shadow, waiting for the first sign of movement. This is Echo Tower to inbound Hercules, Identify yourself immediately or we will consider you hostile, Kara barked into the mic again, voice sharp as a blade. But the only answer was the idle roar of engines. Minutes dragged like hours. The soldiers on the ground began to feel the sweat beneath their helmets, their fingers tense against triggers. Cole advanced down the stairs, his boots striking hard against metal, until he reached the armored cordon at the edge of the tarmac. His eyes locked on the aircraft with the intensity of a predator. He had lost men before to traps dressed as salvation, and every instinct screamed this was the same. He lifted his radio. Team Alpha, flank left. Team Bravo, cover the rear. No one approaches until I give the order. The units moved like shadows, forming a perimeter around the silent beast. The air smelled of dust, oil, and sweat, and every breath seemed too loud. Cole's mind ran through possibilities. A hijack. A decoy. Or worse, an enemy insertion dressed in their own uniform. Then, without warning, the Hercules powered down its engines, one by one, the growl fading into eerie silence. The sudden quiet sent shivers down every spine. In that silence, even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. The side hatch hissed. Every rifle snapped up. A metallic clang echoed as the door swung outward. From the darkness of the interior, shadows shifted, unrecognizable at first. And then a figure stepped out, silhouetted against the floodlights, hands raised high, face obscured. Cole's heart slammed against his ribs. Was this one of theirs, or the beginning of something far worse? The figure froze under the glare of the floodlights, hands lifted, posture rigid as if sculpted from the desert itself. Dust swirled around his boots, carried by the restless wind, and the silence stretched so long it seemed even the Engine's echoes had died. Every rifle remained trained on him, and even from a distance, Cole could see the hesitation in his steps, the way he leaned forward slightly as though fighting an invisible weight. Identify yourself. Cole's command tore through the air, amplified by the radio clamped to his vest. The figure lowered his head, then raised it again, revealing a dirt-streaked face, beard grown long, eyes hollow but alive. Recognition struck. Like lightning. Lieutenant Samir Hale, one of Cole's own, a man believed stranded deep in hostile terrain with the recon team, the man they had been waiting to save. A shockwave of disbelief rippled through the soldiers, their grips on rifles tightening, not loosening because something about his presence here defied logic. He was supposed to be with the others, miles away, begging for extraction. Yet here he was, stepping off a silent Hercules that had defied every rule of procedure. Samir's voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't shoot. It's me, Hale. Cole, it's me." The sound carried desperation but also something else, something fractured. Cole felt his stomach twist, instinct screaming caution. He gestured sharply and a squad surged forward, weapons still raised, circling the lone figure. They ordered him flat to the ground, secured his arms, and dragged him clear of the aircraft's shadow. Cole approached slowly, eyes burning into the man he once trusted. "How did you get here, Hale? Where's the rest of your team?" The lieutenant coughed, dust caking his lips, eyes darting back at the looming shape of the C-130 as though afraid of it. "They're inside. Some of them are alive. Some didn't make it." His voice trembled on the edge of collapse. "We were ambushed, Cole. We had no choice. The bird came for us, no call, no warning, but it came. We got on board. That's all I know." His words didn't fit. They twisted like threads of rope fraying in the wind. No aircraft came without the tower's knowledge. No rescue launched without orders. Cole felt unease dig deeper, roots spreading in his gut. "Search the plane," he ordered flatly, voice low but carrying the weight of command. Teams advanced, boots pounding against the asphalt, weapons drawn. They fanned into the Hercules, floodlights painting the cavernous interior in stark white as shadows fled. The silence cracked almost immediately with shouts. "We've got survivors," someone yelled, voice straining against the noise of movement. Stretcher teams rushed forward, medics springing into action as limp forms were carried from the belly of the bird. Bloodied, unconscious, some groaning, others disturbingly still, they were laid out on the tarmac. Cole's chest tightened as he recognized uniforms torn and dirt-caked, faces pale, soldiers who had been missing for days. Relief rippled across the base, but unease still anchored his thoughts. This was too convenient, too sudden, too silent. As the survivors poured out, some alive, some gone, the question that gnawed at him was simple but merciless. Who was flying the Hercules? The answer came in fragments. A second figure stumbled down the ramp, clutching his side, uniform soaked with blood. He collapsed halfway to the ground, caught by medics. Another followed, then another, until 6 in total had emerged, some conscious, others barely clinging to life. Yet through all the chaos, through all the shouting and rushing of medical teams, no pilot appeared, no crew, no one wearing the headset or uniform of a flight officer. Cole's radio buzzed. "Sir, cockpit's empty. No sign of pilots. Instruments dead. Systems look off. Like it's been rewired." The voice on the other end sounded as if speaking through a throat gripped by fear. Cole's eyes narrowed, jaw grinding hard. An unmanned aircraft couldn't land itself with such precision, not without someone guiding it. And yet here it sat, silent and hulking, its mission fulfilled but its intent shrouded. Hale, still held by two soldiers, struggled against their grip. "You have to believe me, Cole. We boarded in chaos, gunfire everywhere, bodies dropping. We just ran. The ramp closed behind us. I don't know who flew it, I swear. But without it, we'd be dead out there." His voice carried truth, or something so close to truth it was hard to separate. Cole crouched down, locking eyes with him. "If you didn't see who was flying, then who the hell brought you home?" Hale's lips trembled, his eyes flickering with fear as he whispered, "That's what I'm afraid of. It wasn't one of ours. I could feel it, Cole. Something was wrong on that bird." The air felt colder. The instruments glowed wrong. It wasn't just a ride, it was watching us. The words struck like ice water poured over fire. Cole rose abruptly, turning to the Hercules again. Its dark fuselage gleamed under the floodlights, an indifferent giant holding its secrets tight. He barked orders. "Lock it down. No one in or out without clearance. Get me engineers, intelligence, anyone who can tear that thing apart." He paused, his voice lowering, carrying only to those nearest. "And double the guards. If this was a gift, it came wrapped in poison." Around him, soldiers moved fast, chains clanking as barricades rolled into position, armored vehicles repositioned, and heavy guns rotated toward the silent machine. Medics worked feverishly, saving who they could, whispering prayers over those they couldn't. The rescued soldiers, pale and broken, carried eyes full of shadows, eyes that avoided the aircraft as though it still held them hostage. Night thickened over the base, stars pricking the velvet black sky. Floodlights created islands of harsh brilliance, but beyond their reach the desert swallowed everything in silence. Cole remained at the edge of the tarmac, staring at the Hercules as though it might breathe. Every instinct screamed unfinished business. Hale's words gnawed at him. Something watching, instruments glowing wrong, air colder. Machines didn't watch. Planes didn't decide. But something had delivered them here, and it wasn't protocol, wasn't pilots, wasn't control. His radio crackled again, an engineer's voice breaking in. "Sir, you'll want to see this. The avionics panel has inscriptions, markings we don't recognize. Not standard military. Not standard anything." A chill brushed Cole's skin. He answered in a steady growl. "Keep digging. I want every circuit mapped, every wire traced. If this bird came from hell, I want to know which gate it flew out of." Behind him, Hale's voice rose again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Cole, we shouldn't have boarded it. I told them not to, but they were desperate. They said it was salvation. But when the ramp shut, I swear I felt like the plane itself had taken us, not carried us. Like it chose us." His words carried the weight of delirium, but also something heavier, something Cole couldn't shake. Machines weren't supposed to choose. Yet tonight, a silent Hercules had landed without permission, carrying ghosts and survivors alike, and Cole knew with a certainty colder than the desert wind that their nightmare hadn't ended on the tarmac. It had just begun. The desert wind howled through the perimeter fencing, carrying with it whispers of dust that clung to the floodlights and made the entire base seem veiled in something unclean, as if the land itself recoiled from what had landed upon it. Cole stood with arms folded, shoulders rigid, watching the engineers crawl over the Hercules like ants over a carcass, each with flashlights and scanners, their voices hushed even though distance and engines made shouting necessary. It was not the usual mechanical survey. There was reverence in their movements, unease in the way they touched metal, as though it might pulse back. Soldiers tightened patrol routes, boots crunching on gravel, rifles held higher than normal. No one relaxed, not even the medics inside the field hospital tent who whispered as they treated the wounded, glancing outside every few minutes as if afraid the shadow of the aircraft might lengthen and swallow them whole. Cole's eyes narrowed as one of the engineers climbed down the ramp, face pale and drawn, clutching a notepad thick with sketches. He crossed the distance with urgency, stopping just short of Cole. "Sir, you need to see this." Cole flipped through the sketches, his jaw tightening as he studied markings found carved into panels behind the cockpit. They weren't numbers or standard codes. They were symbols, jagged and curved like claw marks frozen into metal, etched into the very bones of the aircraft. Some looked almost mathematical, others like language, but none matched any database. Cole's gut hardened further. This was no ordinary rescue, no ordinary aircraft. He snapped the notepad shut, eyes burning toward the hulking Hercules again. These symbols, could they be enemy tech? Something experimental? The engineer swallowed hard. With respect, sir, this isn't like anything I've seen. It doesn't match known enemy systems, not even experimental alloys. Panels have been fused, not welded. Circuits grown rather than built. It's biological in places, like the machine wasn't manufactured so much as born. Cole's teeth ground together, his mind recoiling. Born. Machines didn't grow. Yet here stood evidence that this bird had, that it had been shaped by hands not their own. He turned sharply, calling for his intelligence officer, a woman named Rowan Cade, sharp-eyed and colder than the desert night. She listened, flipping her pen between fingers, then said flatly, "If it's grown, it can adapt. And if it adapts, it means it's learning. Sir, whatever this thing is, it brought our men back not because we called it, but because it decided to." The words landed like hammer blows in Cole's mind. Decision. Choice. He had fought men, machines, chaos, but never a machine that chose. Hale, sitting nearby under guard, head bandaged and wrists restrained for his own erratic safety, overheard, his face pale. "It's true," he rasped. "When the ramp closed, I swear the walls pulsed. The floor vibrated not like engines but like breathing. I told the others. They laughed. But then they went quiet, every one of them, as if something pressed against their thoughts. You don't understand, Cole, it wanted us. It carried us because it wanted to." Soldiers shifted uneasily at his words, murmurs crackling like dry brush catching flame. Cole silenced them with a glare but couldn't silence the tightening noose in his chest. He had led men against threats he could point a rifle at, threats that bled and died when struck. But how did you fight a machine that breathed, that thought, that carried your men home like a fisherman tossing back what he didn't want? As night deepened, the base's atmosphere grew stranger. Reports filtered in from the medical tent. Some rescued soldiers, while stable, exhibited neurological irregularities, spikes in brain activity, patterns unseen in normal trauma. One medic swore she felt static in the air when she touched a patient, like the hum of live wires beneath skin. Another said the wounded avoided sleep, muttering about lights inside their heads, dreams not their own. Cole listened, jaw tightening further with every report. He issued orders to separate the rescued team, each under observation, no communication between them. If the Hercules had infected them with something, he wasn't going to let it spread unchecked. Yet even as he ordered, doubt gnawed at him. What if the infection wasn't in their bodies but in their minds? Around midnight, while engineers worked under floodlights, something changed. The Hercules, silent for hours, emitted a low hum. Not engines. Not mechanical. A resonance that vibrated the air, subtle at first, then building until it seemed to come from the bones of the base itself. Soldiers gripped rifles tighter, engineers froze, eyes darting to one another. "Shut it down," someone shouted, but no one knew what to shut down. Lights flickered across the aircraft's fuselage, faint, like veins glowing beneath skin. The symbols carved into its panels pulsed faintly, as if answering some unheard call. Cole barked into his radio, "All units stand ready. Perimeter double secure." Men scrambled into position, helicopters spun up, Humvees rolled forward with turrets aimed. Yet through it all, the Hercules only sat there, humming, its glow faint but undeniable, as though reminding them it wasn't finished. Then the voices began. Not loud, not external, but whispered through the minds of those nearest. Soldiers flinched, hands to temples, eyes wide with sudden terror. Engineers dropped tools, staggering back. Even Cole felt it, a pressure behind his eyes, a whisper not of words but of intent, dark and cold, like being measured by something ancient. He forced himself to stand taller, to resist, but around him chaos erupted. One soldier screamed, firing a burst into the dirt before comrades wrenched his rifle away. Another dropped to his knees, muttering, "It sees me, it sees me." Hale convulsed against his restraints, shouting, "I told you! It's awake!" Medics rushed to contain him, but his eyes glowed with feverish intensity, veins bulging. Cole ripped his radio free, roaring, "Shut it down now!" But there was nothing to shut. The Hercules was alive, and alive things didn't respond to switches. Suddenly, as quickly as it had begun, the hum cut off. The glow faded. Silence reigned again, thicker than before, as though the world had inhaled and never exhaled. Soldiers stood frozen, weapons still raised, sweat dripping down faces, breaths ragged. Cole's heart hammered in his chest, but his voice remained steel. Everyone hold position. No one fires unless I give the order. Lock down the survivors. This plane isn't a rescue, it's an intruder. His words echoed across the comms, and for the first time that night, no one argued. Fear bound them together stronger than discipline ever could. Cole turned once more to the Hercules, its shadow vast, its silence now a threat instead of a relief. He knew the truth that every soldier on that tarmac felt in their bones. Something had come to them under the guise of salvation, and now it was inside their base, waiting, watching, patient as death. And in the back of his mind, a thought he could not silence gnawed harder with each passing moment. If the Hercules had delivered them survivors tonight, what would it demand in return tomorrow? The base never truly slept after that night. Even as dawn bled across the horizon, turning the desert from black to bruised violet, every soldier remained at high alert, eyes rimmed red, fingers wrapped too tight around their rifles. The Hercules sat in the middle of the runway like a predator resting after a hunt, inert but never harmless, its fuselage catching the first rays of the sun with a dull metallic sheen. Engineers, under orders, continued their work, though none approached it without trembling hands. They reported new anomalies, panels that seemed to shift subtly when unobserved, circuitry that resisted scans as if cloaking itself, and readings of power sources where none should exist. Cole reviewed each report with a scowl that only deepened, his mind circling the same truth. Whatever that thing was, it had crossed a line between machine and something else, and its motives were still locked away. Rowan Cade, his intelligence officer, cornered him outside the command tent with eyes sharp as shattered glass. "Sir, I think we're making a mistake. Keeping it here, letting it sit, it's studying us. I don't know how, but it is. We're feeding it information by the hour." Cole studied her, jaw tight. "You think it's alive?" She didn't flinch. "No, Captain. I know it is." Before Cole could answer, a commotion erupted near the medical tents. Soldiers shouted, medics screamed orders, and the sound of boots thundered across the dirt. Cole sprinted toward it, Rowan close behind. Inside, chaos boiled. One of the rescued soldiers, Private Lennox, restrained to a cot for his own safety, was convulsing violently, muscles snapping against the straps like cables ready to tear. His eyes rolled back, his mouth foaming, and monitors shrieked with alarms. Medics swarmed, but then in an instant he stilled. The silence that followed was worse than the chaos. Lennox's chest rose once more, shallow, but his eyes opened, and they glowed faintly, not with natural light, but with the same eerie hue that had pulsed from the Hercules markings. Gasps rippled through the tent. The soldier's lips moved, but the words that spilled were not his own. A harsh, metallic whisper slithered from his throat, a language jagged and alien, filling the tent with vibrations that made the air shiver. Cole barked, "Restrain him," but before they could, Lennox's body arched and he screamed, a sound that wasn't human, high-pitched and layered, as if a dozen voices shrieked at once. Lights flickered, instruments shattered, and the very air seemed to bend. Then it stopped. The glow faded, Lennox collapsed lifeless, monitors flatlining in unison. For a moment no one moved. Cole's heart hammered as medics scrambled, futilely pounding his chest, shouting his name, but it was already over. Lennox was gone, his body limp, his face twisted in a final grimace of terror. Rowan's voice cut sharp through the stunned silence. "Sir, that wasn't possession. That was communication." Her eyes burned with cold certainty. "It used him. The plane, whatever's behind it, it spoke through him." Cole felt the words slice through his core. Communication. The thought was worse than possession. It meant intent. It meant the Hercules wasn't a vessel by accident. It had purpose, design, and now it was reaching into their very flesh to speak. He turned on his heel, storming out of the tent, rage boiling under his skin. The Hercules loomed in the morning sun, innocent in appearance, monstrous in truth. "Get me heavy ordnance," Cole ordered into his radio. "Tanks, missile units, the works. If that thing so much as hums again, I want it torn apart." His men obeyed, but hesitation lurked in their movements, a collective fear that no shell or missile would matter. Still, armored columns rolled into position, barrels aimed at the silent hulk. Drones were launched, circling overhead, feeding data back into command. Engineers withdrew reluctantly, leaving the aircraft sealed under guard. Yet even as Cole bristled with readiness, doubt whispered. What if destroying it killed the survivors still unconscious in the tents? What if this thing had rooted itself in them somehow? His thoughts burned hotter as Rowan stepped up beside him. "You're preparing for war against something we don't understand, Captain. I'm not saying don't, hell maybe you're right, but what if you provoke it? What if it's waiting for that exact response? Cole's eyes stayed locked on the Hercules. If it's waiting, then it's already playing us. And I don't let enemies write the rules of my field. Hours crawled. The sun climbed higher, burning mercilessly, and sweat rolled beneath armor. Still the Hercules sat unmoving, a titan pretending to sleep. But tension like this couldn't hold forever. At midday it broke. An alarm screamed from the perimeter. Sensors detected motion, faint, erratic, then surging. Cole and Rowan rushed to the monitors. What they saw froze the room. Dozens of heat signatures were advancing toward the base from the desert, stumbling, shambling, their patterns broken but relentless. Scouts were dispatched and returned within minutes, breathless and pale. "Sir, they're ours. They're soldiers. Recon units that never came back." Cole's blood ran cold. The recon team was already accounted for. Those who lived were inside the tents, those who didn't lay in bags. Whoever these were, they weren't survivors. The shambling figures drew closer, their uniforms shredded, faces pale under the brutal sun, eyes vacant but glowing faintly like Lennox's had. Their pace was unnatural, jerky yet unstoppable, like puppets driven by invisible strings. Cole's gut clenched as realization struck. The Hercules hadn't just delivered survivors. It had delivered seeds. And now its crop was walking toward them. "All units to the perimeter." Cole roared. Sirens blared, soldiers poured into position, machine guns mounted, missiles primed. Dust clouds rose as the shambling figures came into full view, unarmed but horrifying in their steady march. The order to fire trembled on Cole's lips, his instincts screaming to unleash hell, yet doubt clawed him. What if this was still part of the test? Rowan's voice cut sharp. "If you hesitate, they'll be inside the wire. Fire, Captain, now." Cole dropped his hand. Gunfire exploded in unison, shredding the desert air. Machine guns roared, missiles screamed, explosions tore through sand and flesh alike. The figures dropped in heaps, torn apart, but as the dust cleared, more appeared on the horizon, glowing eyes steady, advancing without hesitation. For every one cut down, two more seemed to rise as if the desert itself spat them out. Soldiers cursed, rifles overheated, yet the tide kept coming. Cole's heart pounded as realization sank deep. This wasn't an attack meant to breach. It was pressure. A test of their resolve, their limits, their willingness to slaughter what looked like their own. Behind them, the Hercules hummed faintly, its glow returning in rhythm with the slaughter, feeding off it like a beast savoring its kill. Cole's lips drew tight. Whatever it wasn't done watching, and it wasn't finished with them yet. The sudden arrival of the C-130 had thrown everything into a state of blurred tension. Dust still hung in the air around the airstrip like a storm that refused to settle, grit biting into eyes and throats as the soldiers tried to make sense of the situation. For hours after the massive transport had rolled to a stop, its engines whining down with a reluctant groan, the stranded unit on the ground could do little but stare at it and wonder if salvation had truly arrived or if the nightmare had only changed shape. Their radios remained silent, the tower gave no clearance, and command, wherever it was, still had not sent confirmation of any planned rescue. Yet the plane sat there, hulking and still, its paint chipped, its insignia faded, its cargo ramp lowered like the mouth of some silent beast waiting to reveal what it carried. Nobody rushed to meet it. Everyone braced for either hope or catastrophe. Captain Rourke, his jaw locked so tight his teeth ached, finally ordered his men to form a perimeter, weapons up, eyes sharper than ever. The weeks of isolation and skirmishes had left them half feral, balanced on the thin edge of exhaustion and suspicion. A rescue would mean relief, but an unannounced plane, especially one that defied protocol by landing without tower clearance, reeked of something else. And in their world, something else usually meant danger. The sun beat mercilessly on the cracked tarmac, heat shimmering in thick ripples, while silence stretched until it was unbearable. Finally, a faint metallic clank echoed from inside the C-130's belly, followed by the slow shuffle of footsteps. A figure appeared at the top of the cargo ramp. The soldiers immediately raised their rifles, squinting against the glare. The figure stepped down, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing fatigues caked in dust and grime. A helmet dangled loosely from one hand. His posture was too casual, too unhurried, and the way he paused halfway down the ramp to survey the airstrip sent a ripple of unease through the watching men. Captain Rourke barked out a challenge, demanding identification. The figure didn't answer immediately, instead letting the silence draw out like a taut wire. Then, with a smile that did not belong in such a place, he raised his other hand in mock surrender. "Relax, gentlemen," he called, voice carrying easily across the flat expanse. "We're here for you." The words should have been comforting. Instead they chilled everyone to the bone. "We?" Rourke demanded. At that, more figures began to emerge from the shadowed interior of the C-130. A half dozen at first, then more, each one armed, each one moving with disciplined precision. They wore mismatched uniforms, some with no insignia at all, and their weapons gleamed too new, too well maintained for the chaos that had supposedly been ravaging supply lines. Rourke's gut twisted. Whoever these people were, they didn't belong to any sanctioned rescue operation. His soldiers knew it too. Fingers tightened on triggers, breaths grew ragged. The tension was so sharp it felt like a matchstick could set off an inferno. Then the first of the strangers reached the bottom of the ramp, boots crunching on gravel, eyes scanning the perimeter with unsettling calm. "Orders are simple," the leader said, smile never wavering. "We pick you up, get you out, take you somewhere safe. Command didn't have time to brief you, but that's not unusual, is it?" Rourke's mind raced. Everything about the man was wrong. The cadence of his words, the way he seemed rehearsed, the way his gaze slid too quickly across faces as though cataloging them instead of addressing them. And still, no communication had come through the radios. He thought of his men, exhausted and starved for hope, so close to grasping the idea of rescue. If he rejected these newcomers outright, morale could fracture. But if he accepted, they could be walking into a trap. His decision had to be instant, and it had to be absolute. "Guns down," he called softly to his soldiers, though his own rifle remained angled and ready. "But stay sharp." He stepped forward, closing the gap between his perimeter and the strangers. The man who claimed to be in charge extended a hand, grin broadening. "Major Kellen," he introduced himself. "Good to finally meet you." Rourke didn't take the hand. Instead, he looked over Kellen's shoulder at the C-130. The interior was dark, but he could make out silhouettes. More men, perhaps supplies, perhaps something else entirely. His mind flashed back to the weeks of silence, the broken promises of reinforcements, the sudden desperation of an unplanned landing. A sick suspicion rooted itself in his chest. This wasn't rescue. It was collection. And they weren't being saved, they were being claimed. Kellen seemed to read the hesitation in his eyes, because his smile faltered just slightly, enough to betray the edge of impatience. "Captain," he said, his tone harder now, less performative. "You and your people have been waiting for relief. Well, here it is. Don't make this difficult." That change of tone was enough. Rourke's instincts roared. He glanced back at his men, saw their faces pale, saw their rifles twitch. They were ready to believe but terrified of the truth. He needed clarity, something undeniable. So he asked the one question that would break the mask. "What's the code word for extraction?" For a second the air itself seemed to freeze. Kellen's expression barely shifted, but the pause was too long. And when he finally answered, his words were meaningless, just a bluff dressed up as military jargon. Rourke raised his rifle without hesitation. "Not another step," he ordered, voice like iron. The standoff crystallized instantly. His men raised their weapons again, lining up sights on the intruders. Kellen's soldiers mirrored the gesture, rifles snapping up with mechanical efficiency. For a heartbeat, time hung suspended between two choices: surrender to the supposed rescue or ignite a battle on their only strip of salvation. The silence was broken not by gunfire but by a sound from the C-130 itself. A metallic thud, deep within the cargo hold, followed by a muffled cry. Every soldier heard it. Rourke's heart slammed against his ribs. Someone was inside, restrained. A prisoner. Kellen's mask of confidence slipped further, his jaw tightening as though he knew the noise had betrayed them. "Captain," he said sharply, "lower your weapon. You don't understand what's at stake here." But Rourke understood enough. This was not a rescue mission. It was a hijack, a forced relocation, or worse. The C-130 was not salvation. It was a trap, and the men who stepped off its ramp were not allies. They were hunters, and his unit was the prey. What happened next would define everything. Rourke could feel his men looking to him, waiting for a signal, desperate for certainty in a world where nothing had been certain for weeks. He thought of their dead comrades, of the endless nights surrounded by gunfire and whispers of betrayal. He thought of the silence on the radios, of command that had abandoned them, of the bitter grit of sand between his teeth as he swore he would not let them die forgotten. And so, with the heat of the sun burning into his skin and the cold weight of destiny pressing into his bones, Captain Rourke made his choice. He steadied his aim, voice carrying across the airstrip with the force of command. "This is our ground. Step back or we will defend it." The men around him shifted, shoulders stiffening, eyes narrowing. They had been bracing for rescue. Instead they braced for war. And the airstrip, once a place of silence and dust, now trembled on the edge of violence so sharp it felt inevitable. The air inside the base control tower was heavy with tension as word spread about the mysterious C-130 that had landed without tower permission. The base personnel who had rushed out earlier to surround it had still not returned, their radios silent as if something had cut them off from the outside world. Commander Harris stood by the observation window, jaw clenched tight as he looked down at the runway where the gray beast of an aircraft sat unmoving, its engines now cooled to silence. Spotlights illuminated its hull, casting long shadows that gave it a haunting presence. Everyone on the base had expected a routine rescue, maybe a delayed mission or stranded crew, but what they had instead was a puzzle wrapped in fear. The aircraft had touched down without clearance, ignored hails, and now sat like a sleeping predator. Harris finally spoke, his voice sharp. "We send a squad inside. Full tactical gear but no unnecessary aggression. If there's someone in there, they're going to answer questions today." His men nodded, though unease flickered across their faces. The aircraft was American, but the unease that clung to it made them feel as if they were dealing with something foreign. The squad of 8 moved across the runway, weapons at the ready, the sound of their boots echoing in the still night. The closer they came, the more massive the C-130 seemed, towering above them like some slumbering creature. Its rear ramp was partially lowered, hanging at an angle as if it had been stopped mid-motion. A dim red light glowed faintly from within, bathing the interior in an eerie hue. Sergeant Miller, who led the squad, signaled for 2 men to cover the sides while he and another soldier approached the ramp. The smell hit them first, a strange mix of fuel, metal, and something organic like rot. It was faint, but it was enough to make them exchange glances. "Command, we're at the ramp," Miller whispered into his radio, though the static that returned told him the signal was being scrambled. They were on their own now. He lifted his rifle higher and motioned for the men to follow. The ramp creaked under their weight as they stepped onto it. The red light inside flickered, almost as if reacting to their presence. When their eyes adjusted, they saw the cargo bay was empty, or nearly empty. The seats that lined the interior were filled with duffel bags, gear, and flight suits, but the air felt wrong, heavy, and oppressive, as though the oxygen itself was laced with some unseen weight. Private Dawson muttered, "Where the hell is everyone?" His voice trembled despite his attempt to sound calm. Miller hushed him quickly. The group moved further inside, scanning every shadow, every corner. That was when they noticed the seats. At first glance, they looked like empty uniforms stuffed into gear, but as the light flickered, it revealed something more grotesque. The flight suits weren't empty, they were occupied. Bodies slumped inside them, rigid and pale, faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Their eyes were open but glassy, staring at nothing. One man's mouth was locked in a silent scream, his hands gripping the straps of his seatbelt as though he had tried to rip it off before whatever had happened overtook him. Dawson gagged loudly and another soldier cursed under his breath. Miller forced himself forward, pressing a gloved hand against one of the corpses next, though he already knew the truth. Cold. Lifeless. Yet no visible wounds. He pulled back quickly. "They're all dead," he muttered, his voice shaking despite his training. Then he froze. The corpses were all strapped down except for one seat in the front row. Its harness was torn open, the buckles bent as if someone, or something, had broken free with unnatural strength. The empty seat gave Miller a cold chill that spread through his spine. He raised his rifle instinctively. "Eyes up," he ordered. His men moved, scanning every shadow of the cargo bay, their flashlights dancing against metal walls, the flickering red light making it all worse. Then they heard it, a sound from deeper inside the aircraft near the cockpit. A dragging, scraping noise like metal against metal, but slow, deliberate. Everyone froze in place, listening. The noise grew louder, closer, echoing through the hollow belly of the plane. Private Dawson whispered, "That's not human." Miller shot him a glare, but even he could feel the truth in those words. He gestured silently, splitting the squad. 4 men advanced slowly toward the cockpit, while the other 4 held their ground by the ramp. Every footstep echoed like thunder in the unnatural silence. When Miller reached the bulkhead separating the cockpit from the bay, he paused, pressing his ear to the cold metal. The scraping had stopped. He slowly reached for the handle, then nodded to his men. Together they pulled it open and swept inside. The cockpit was a nightmare frozen in time. The pilots sat slumped in their chairs, their skin as pale and waxen as the others in the back. Their hands were still on the controls, but their faces were locked in twisted agony, eyes wide and unblinking. The instrument panels flickered with erratic readings, warning lights flashing without reason. The air smelled worse here, thicker with that strange organic rot, making every breath a struggle. But worse than the sight of the dead was what lay between them. The co-pilot's seat was empty, but something was smeared across the console. Symbols written in a dark, sticky substance that could only be blood. Jagged, unfamiliar symbols that looked nothing like English, nothing like anything they had ever seen. They pulsed faintly in the dim light as though alive. One of the soldiers swore violently. Miller felt his heart hammering in his chest. "Command needs to see this," he muttered, but again his radio only gave static. He felt isolated, cut off, trapped inside a steel coffin with something unseen. Then, as if to confirm his fear, the scraping sound started again, this time from behind them. They spun, rifles raised, flashlights piercing the shadows. The sound moved rapidly through the cargo bay, echoing between the seats. Dawson shouted, firing a burst into the darkness. The gunfire roared in the confined space, the muzzle flashes illuminating the frozen faces of the dead passengers. But when the light cleared, nothing was there. Only silence. The squad regrouped quickly, panic seeping into their movements. Miller knew they had to get out to report what they had found, but something in the air told him they might already be too late. He barked the order, "Fall back. We're leaving." The men didn't argue. They turned, moving quickly toward the ramp, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. But just as they reached it, the entire plane shuddered violently, like it had been struck by some invisible force. The ramp slammed shut with a deafening clang, sealing them inside. The red light brightened, flooding the cargo bay in an oppressive glow. And then the voices began. At first it was faint, like whispers in the walls, a dozen voices overlapping, speaking in a language none of them recognized. The sound grew louder, crawling into their heads, making their ears ring and their thoughts blur. Some of the men screamed, clutching their helmets, dropping rifles as if the sound itself burned them. Miller fought to stay grounded, gripping his weapon tight as he tried to block it out. The whispers grew clearer, and though he didn't understand the words, he understood the feeling behind them: hunger, rage, and something far worse: possession. The voices clawed at their minds until thought itself felt like it was being pulled apart thread by thread, and for a moment Miller thought he would lose himself to the storm of sound, but training and sheer will forced him to plant his boots on the floor and push back against the invisible tide. He barked at his men to hold it together, though his voice came out ragged and drowned beneath the unnatural chorus echoing through the steel hull of the C-130. Private Dawson was the first to break, screaming as he fired blindly into the shadows, the muzzle flashes creating violent bursts of light that revealed nothing but dead faces frozen in their seats and the eerie smear of symbols glowing faintly across the cockpit glass. The bullets ricocheted off bulkheads, sparks dancing in the oppressive red light, but the whispers only grew louder, almost mocking the futility of their resistance. Another soldier dropped his rifle and clawed at his helmet as if trying to dig the voices out of his skull. Miller grabbed him, slapping him hard across the cheek, shouting for him to focus, but the soldier's eyes were wide and glazed, unseeing, his mouth muttering fragments of the same foreign language that bled from the walls. A sudden crash shook the plane, metal groaning as if something enormous pressed against its skin from the outside. The entire fuselage tilted, throwing men against the cargo netting and scattering rifles across the floor. Miller slammed against the wall, his ribs aching, but he scrambled to his feet, grabbing his weapon with white-knuckled desperation. He shouted to the squad, his words cutting through the storm of sound like a whip crack. "On me. Stay together." His men, panicked but loyal, forced themselves into formation, huddling close as the shadows shifted unnaturally across the walls. The dead strapped in their seats seemed almost to twitch in the corner of his eye, their glassy eyes glinting whenever the flickering light struck them, but when he focused they remained still, corpses caught in eternal terror. The feeling that they were not alone, that something unseen was moving between them, watching them, grew unbearable. Then the ramp, which had slammed shut moments before, shuddered violently and began to lower on its own. The grinding of hydraulics filled the bay, and for an instant hope flared in Miller's chest that perhaps reinforcements outside had forced it open. But when the ramp finally hit the tarmac with a loud metallic thud, the sight beyond it froze him cold. The runway outside was no longer lit by the base's floodlights. Instead, a swirling darkness had swallowed everything, a wall of shadow stretching in every direction as though the world itself had been erased. And standing at the edge of that ramp was a figure, tall and indistinct, its shape constantly shifting like smoke caught in a storm. Its head tilted unnaturally as though it was studying them, and when it moved, its motions were fluid yet broken, jerking like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. The voices in their heads grew sharper, more direct, and Miller realized the whispers were not just random noise, they were commands, attempts to bend their wills, to make them kneel. "Don't listen," he roared, his throat raw, forcing his men back into a defensive line. He raised his rifle and fired at the figure, bullets tearing through it, but instead of falling it seemed to ripple, its body absorbing the rounds as though they meant nothing. The air grew colder, their breaths misting, and the stench of decay filled the cargo bay so thickly it made their stomachs heave. Private Dawson broke again, stumbling forward toward the ramp with his rifle lowered, his expression vacant, his mouth murmuring in that alien tongue. Miller lunged and grabbed him, pulling him back just as the shadow figure's long, smoke-like arm reached out. The fingers stretched impossibly far, brushing against Dawson's shoulder, and where it touched his uniform the fabric blackened instantly, sizzling as though burned by acid. Dawson screamed, finally waking from his trance, but the damage was done. His shoulder was scorched through, flesh seared beneath. Miller dragged him back into the group, heart hammering as he realized the thing wanted them alive but broken, dominated, enslaved. The squad opened fire all at once, muzzle flashes strobing the darkness, filling the cargo bay with the thunder of gunfire. Brass casings clattered to the floor, the air filling with the acrid stench of gunpowder, but the figure at the ramp did not fall. Instead, it retreated slowly, drifting backward into the swirling wall of black beyond the plane. The voices inside their heads receded slightly, still present but muffled, like whispers from the far end of a tunnel. For a brief, precious moment the squad had control again. Miller seized the opportunity. "Move! Off the ramp now!" he bellowed, and the squad surged forward, carrying the wounded Dawson with them. They ran down the ramp, boots slamming against the metal, but instead of the familiar tarmac beneath their feet they found only shifting black mist. The base was gone, the runway gone, even the horizon itself swallowed in shadow. The C-130 now sat in an impossible void, suspended in a realm that should not exist. Panic surged through the men as they stumbled onto the misty surface that somehow held their weight. It swirled beneath their boots, pulling at them like sluggish water, but solid enough to carry them forward. Behind them, the ramp began to rise again with a hydraulic groan, sealing the plane as if to trap whatever was left inside. Miller forced his squad to move, screaming at them to push through the fog, though none of them knew where they were going. The oppressive darkness pressed in from every side, their flashlights barely cutting more than a few feet before the beams were swallowed whole. Shadows twisted at the edge of vision, figures lurking just beyond clarity, and the whispers returned, rising like a tide, calling each soldier by name now, personalized, intimate, digging into their memories and fears. One voice spoke to Miller in the tone of his wife, another in the voice of a fallen comrade, trying to weaken him, to lure him into surrender. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself forward. "Ignore it. Keep moving," he shouted, though he could see some of his men trembling, their eyes darting into the black as though they half believed the voices were real. The fog parted suddenly, revealing something ahead, a structure rising out of the void. It looked like the skeletal remains of a control tower, twisted and broken, yet glowing faintly with the same pulsating symbols they had seen in the cockpit. The light seemed to beckon them, and though every instinct in Miller's body screamed it was a trap, it was the only landmark in this impossible realm. They had no choice. The squad advanced toward it, carrying Dawson between them as he groaned in pain, his uniform still smoking from the shadow's touch. The closer they came, the louder the whispers became, the symbols thrumming with power, pulsing in rhythm with their own heartbeats until it felt like the symbols themselves were inside them, rewriting something fundamental in their bones. Miller stopped at the base of the tower's twisted ladder, staring up at the ruin that seemed both alien and familiar. He turned to his men, seeing their faces pale and slick with sweat, eyes wild. "We hold here," he said hoarsely, gripping his rifle tighter than ever. "We hold and we don't give in. Whatever this place is, whatever it wants, we fight." The control tower loomed above them like the skeleton of a dead giant, its framework twisted yet pulsing faintly with that sickly red light that made every nerve in their body scream with warning. The whispers were unbearable now, no longer muffled but clear and insistent, overlapping voices that each soldier recognized in some way. One man heard the soothing tone of his mother long dead, another the laughter of his daughter he had not seen in months, and Miller heard his wife's voice calling him home. It was a temptation so cruel and intimate it clawed directly into their willpower, but the captain forced himself forward, refusing to let the seduction pull him under. He raised his rifle high and fired a burst into the glowing symbols etched into the tower's metal skin. Sparks flew and the structure trembled, the voices shattering into pained shrieks that made the men stumble to their knees clutching their heads. For the first time the enemy sounded wounded, and that gave Miller a flicker of hope. He pulled his squad back together, rallying them with sheer force of command. "It can bleed," he roared. "It can bleed, and if it can bleed we can kill it." They circled the base of the tower, rifles trained upward, watching as shapes began to crawl from the fog. Dozens of figures emerged, half-formed, flickering in and out of solidity, their faces frozen in masks of suffering that were disturbingly familiar. Miller recognized one instantly, the face of Corporal Jenkins, who had died weeks earlier during their desperate retreat across the desert. But Jenkins's face was warped, his mouth stretched impossibly wide as he whispered in that same alien tongue. Others appeared too, fallen comrades twisted into mockeries of themselves, eyes black voids, movements jerking like broken marionettes. The squad faltered, horror cutting deeper than any bullet wound. Private Dawson, half-conscious from his burned shoulder, began to sob. "It's them," he muttered weakly. "They're all here. Everyone we lost." Miller's heart cracked at the sight, but he knew the truth. These were not their comrades. They were puppets, illusions shaped by whatever intelligence ruled this place, and they had been conjured for one purpose: to break the living. "Stand fast," Miller shouted, firing into the first figure that lunged at them. The bullets tore through the twisted body, shredding it into mist that dispersed into the air, but immediately two more replaced it, crawling forward with claws of shadow that scraped against the misty ground. The squad fired in unison, muzzle flashes strobing the nightmarish battlefield. Each figure that fell evaporated into smoke, but the cost was ammunition they could not spare. The void seemed endless, and so did the enemy. Miller knew they couldn't win a war of attrition. Their only chance was the tower. He pointed toward its twisted ladder, shouting, "Inside! That's the heart of it." His men obeyed, dragging Dawson with them, firing backward as they advanced. The closer they got, the louder the tower's pulsating hum became, and the stronger the pull of the whispers clawing into their minds. Some soldiers began to falter, their steps slowing as they stared blankly at the apparitions that beckoned them with outstretched arms. Miller shoved them forward, striking helmets with the butt of his rifle to snap them back into reality. They reached the base and scrambled up the warped ladder one by one, the enemy closing in from every direction. Miller covered the rear, firing until his rifle clicked empty. He drew his sidearm and kept shooting, his arms burning with the effort. When the last man reached the first landing, Miller scrambled up behind them, pulling himself into the tower's interior just as shadowy claws slashed across the ladder where he had been a moment earlier. Inside was worse. The tower's hollow core pulsed with living light, the walls covered in those same jagged symbols, only here they were brighter, alive, almost breathing. The whispers were deafening, a chorus so loud it felt like their skulls would split. And in the center of the chamber stood a figure unlike the smoky shadows outside. This one was solid, towering, its body a shifting blend of flesh and metal, its eyes pits of molten red. It regarded them with an intelligence that was ancient and merciless. Miller knew without words that this was the source, the heart of the corruption, the puppeteer that had pulled them into this void. The creature raised its hands, and the walls of the tower vibrated violently. The symbols glowed brighter, and every soldier dropped to their knees screaming as invisible chains wrapped around their minds. Miller staggered but refused to bow. He forced himself forward, raising his pistol with trembling hands. The entity tilted its head as if amused, the whispers in his mind twisting now into a single voice, deep and resonant. "You are mine already," it said without sound, the words directly in his thoughts. "Lay down your weapons and accept eternity." Miller spat on the ground, defiance flaring even as blood trickled from his nose. "We don't belong to you," he growled and fired point blank into its chest. The shot exploded with blinding light. The creature roared, a sound that shook the entire tower, and for a moment the whispers broke, scattering into static. His men, freed from the crushing weight, scrambled to their feet, unleashing everything they had into the entity. Bullets tore chunks from its body, each impact releasing bursts of energy that destabilized the symbols around them. The tower groaned, its very structure beginning to collapse. The entity lashed out, its arm elongating into a blade of shadow that skewered one soldier through the chest, lifting him screaming before flinging him into the wall where he dissolved into nothing. Another was snatched and dragged upward into the symbols, his body swallowed whole by the living wall. Panic surged through the survivors, but Miller pushed them forward, deeper into the chamber toward a glowing core at the center of the floor. It pulsed like a heart, each beat rattling their bones. "That's it," he shouted. "Take it out." They threw grenades, primed explosives, anything they had left, hurling them onto the core. The entity roared again, its body unraveling into tendrils of shadow as it tried to stop them, but Miller leapt onto the core himself, slamming down the last of his charges. He looked up at the towering abomination, meeting its burning eyes with his own. "You picked the wrong squad," he growled and hit the detonator. The explosion was blinding, tearing through the chamber in a wave of white light that consumed everything. Miller felt himself hurled backward, weightless, the sound of the blast deafening and the whispers finally silenced. For a moment there was nothing but light and wind rushing past him, then darkness, then silence. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on cracked tarmac, the sky above him once again a pale dawn streaked with clouds. The airstrip stretched around him, broken but real, the C-130 gone as if it had never existed. He staggered to his feet, head spinning, ears ringing. Around him only 3 of his men remained, battered and bleeding but alive. Private Dawson was among them, his burned shoulder wrapped hastily in bandages, his face pale but his eyes still alert. The others were gone, swallowed by the void forever. Miller looked at them, then at the empty runway where the nightmare had begun. None of them spoke for a long time. When the base personnel finally arrived, sprinting toward them with weapons raised and medics in tow, Miller felt no relief, only the crushing weight of what had been lost and what had been survived. The officers demanded answers, asked where the C-130 had gone, what had happened, why half his squad was missing. Miller simply stared at them with hollow eyes and said nothing. Because how could he explain? How could he make them understand the place beyond the shadows, the whispers that had tried to consume their souls, the ancient intelligence they had fought and only barely escaped? Some things had no place in reports, no place in words. Some things lived only in the silence between survivors who shared the same haunted stare. And so Miller walked away from the runway, each step heavy, his men at his side, knowing the war wasn't over. The whispers were gone, but silence never lasted long. And somewhere, in some shadow beyond sight, the enemy would be waiting again. The end.